So you have the best audience one could ask for, civil society, and they are all very eager to hear how the SDGs are implemented in your countries. We are all open ears. Let's begin with Japan. So Japan has established an SDGs promotion headquarters that is led by not other than the Prime Minister itself. Can you please explain or describe the process of setting up the headquarters, how it operates, both on macro and micro levels, and how it helps Japan to implement some of the goals?
I haven't really expected to be a first speaker. So,
you want to rest a
bit?
No,
it's
all
right. It's all right. Let me introduce myself. I just came to Israel 2 months ago, but a few years ago, I was DG for global issues and dealing with SDGs in Japan. But back 2013, even before the adoption of the SDGs in New York, I took part in the preparatory process of SDGs. There were 2 work streams. First one is an open working group, and second one is a finance committee. I took part in this finance committees, but my engagement was only 6 months. But at that time I was wondering whether we can really reach a meaningful conclusion at the end of a really long discussion. But fortunately, 2015 in September there was a really special summit, and the Prime Minister Abe also took part in that summit, and then. At that time I was abroad and came back to Tokyo early 2016. Now my agenda is how to implement SDGs in Japan. And we had a series of discussion with the civil society. In Japan, there is what we call the SDGs network of civil society. And from time to time, we had a discussion, and our civil society asked us to take a lead in the SDGs implementation in Japan. But in my really personal view at that time, I was a bit reluctant to take charge of the SDGs, as I'm an official of Foreign Affairs Ministry. The duty is really taking care of the developing countries. So what we call development cooperation, or ODAs, take charge of the poverty issues abroad and so on. So now that this time SDGs, all the UN member countries are the target. And as you know, the 17 goals and 169 targets. So the SDGs at the beginning was criticized, it's like a Christmas tree. We reached consensus. All the UN members reached a consensus that something really unprecedented issue. So. Then I have to talk about this headquarters issue. Then afterwards, the Foreign Affairs Ministry alone cannot tackle SDGs issue. So we started to talk with the Prime Minister's office. So how to overcome the bureaucracy of the administration. I think all the countries or governments have the what we call silo, or fragmentation of the bureaucracy. So in order to address the SDGs, we have to overcome this silo approach or fragmented approach, and then we need a strong leadership. So we set up the what we call SDGs promotion headquarters, headed by the Prime Minister and then attended by all the ministers. So we organize this almost cabinet meeting once per 6 months, and then what else? We need to how can I say, simplify this 17 goals, 169 targets. So what we did at the outset is we elaborated what we call guiding principles. Guiding principles is just to simplify the priorities or principles of the 70 goals and 169 targets. So I'm not going to raise all the sort of principles or the elements of, but we simplified 7 priorities issues, and 7 priority issues will cover 17 goals and 169 targets, and also some basic principles like transparency or inclusiveness or universality and so on. And we do Foreign Affairs Minister or Prime Minister's office ask all the government agencies to put forward specific measures relating to the SDGs agenda. So we started from there. There is a sort of, how can I say, mapping of the SDGs related measures in Japan. On the other hand, we have to really, how can I say, engage multiple stakeholders. So we set up what we call a roundtable meeting, including, of course, civil society, labor union, consumers association, and international organizations, academia, well, what else? So we try to, and also the local governments. We try to listen to the everybody, and it's not an easy task. So, and then whenever we have come up to some conclusion, we ask the public comments for around 1 month or 2 months, and we try to put all these sort of core elements in guiding principles, and also later we elaborated the action plans. So that, and one more, maybe I talk too much. One more thing is that we need to raise the public awareness for the SDGs. I think you recognize this pin badge. This is something UN organization we can buy or we can get for free. It depends, but when we started this SDGs exercise in 2016, so I think very few people wore this pin badge. But nowadays, whenever I receive the CEOs or the coming from Japan, they put this pin badge. As the head of Japanese business federations, he always put this pin badge at the press conferences. And now Japan is a homogeneous society. All the CEOs or the executive directors, they now put this pin badge. Yeah. And we also set up what we call the SDGs award. It's not a financial reward, but at the end of the year, always we sort of decorate their local governments or companies or universities which did some sort of good practice for SDGs implementation. The Prime Minister award, what we call the SDGs award. So that is one sort of example, but maybe I better stop here.
Yeah, we'll continue later. You'll have more opportunity. So from Asia, we're going to Latin America, to Colombia. What I'm sure interests lots of people here in the room is how you implement the SDG as a platform for peace building, and how you solve conflict challenges through the SDG platform. And please inspire us, because we need some inspiration in this part.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for organizing this event in Israel. I'm very honored to share the table with my distinguished colleagues from Japan, Ireland, and UK. And this is, in my case, the only developing country thinking about, the SDGs. As you know, this is universal agenda. And let me just stress that the SDG 2030 agenda is this agenda for peace. there is no sustainable development without peace, and there is no peace without sustainable development. And this is for all countries. And this is one of the main issues that the SDGs and the characteristic of this after the Millennium Development Goals. That is as you know, the Millennium Development Goals was for developing countries. But this agenda is for all countries. If you look, for example, the 17 objectives, you think, for example, in the case of Israel, and I'm sure in the case of Ireland, or Japan, or UK, that there is not so much to do of course, but in terms of no poverty, hunger, because developed countries has already, overpassed these challenges. That this is different in countries like my country, Colombia, where we have to do a lot in terms of eradication of poverty, in terms of gender equality, in terms of infrastructure, in governance, in many of the areas. But also in developed countries, there are another challenging task. For example, the patterns of consumption, for example, this is one of the issues that is in discussion right now. So the most important thing of the SDGs is that it's a collective will, in order that we have to continue working in order to have a better growth forward. In the case of Colombia, let me tell you that in a formal way, we introduce all the targets in our national development plans, even before the approval of SDGs at the United Nations. So formally, there is a strong commitment of the government to implement the SDGs. But our main task is how to transform this formal commitment, this will, in order to the reality. How do our Colombian society, civil society, people.
Maybe switch
okay,
to this
so how,
or
I am just telling you, I'm sorry, how to transform this formal, framework that we have. Okay, thank you. Now you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was telling you that formally, we took steps in order to introduce our SDGs in our national development plans, and we are working. Colombia is now in the process to present a voluntary review at the United Nations this year. This is the second report, a voluntary review, because we are with a strong commitment to follow up the Agenda 2030. And I was telling you, this is our main challenge is how to transform this formal framework that we have established in the central government into the reality, not only in the main cities, urban cities, but also around the country, especially in connection with the situation in a country like Colombia that, we suffer internal conflict for more than 50 years. Since 60s, we have internal conflict. And the internal conflict, the root of that conflict was because there is a very abysmal gap in development between the main cities of Colombia, like Bogotá, Cali, and in the faraway places in the country. So there is a very enormous, a very big gap that creates violence, because there were no opportunities for people to get access to the basic services, to the opportunities in many areas. And that's why, we had to take the decision to make peace in order to have this population that were in hands of the guerrilla groups in a very remote areas of the country. It was another Colombia. It was, not half of the country, but a great part of the territory under control of the guerrilla groups, because there were no opportunities, there were no presence of the state in those areas. So the peace, the process of peace, and finally, the peace agreement that was inspired, by Ireland, because by countries of the European Union, of course UK, and also the international community, who helped Colombia in order to proceed to take the courageous decision to deal peace with the guerrilla groups and say, we have to work together, we recognize you as an actor, that you are part of the Colombian society, and we have to work together in order to advance in peace and development. And this is, I think, considered as part of the SDGs. On the other hand, let me tell you the role of the civil society is important. One of our, concerns is how to have in the regional and the local level consciousness about the importance of SDGs. And the only way to do that is about, taking, seriously steps regarding the education of people. It means, for example, one thing is in terms of the local elections, candidates must address how they were going to implement SDGs in the local communities and also in the regional areas. And it will also affect how the country nationally will advance in the implementing the Agenda 2030. The third point that I want to mention is financiation. Do you know how to finance? How to finance is a really ambitious agenda because it requires trillions of dollars around the globe in order to implement it. And how the resources will come. So there is not, it's not enough to have the philanthropy or the private sector responsibility. It will need some collective strategies in order to put the projects that we need on each of the goals to be profitable projects for the private sector, but also beneficial for the communities. That's one of the main challenges we consider that not only in Colombia, but also around the globe we have to work. And finally, just to let my colleagues to make their comments, is regarding the implementation, of course, the SDGs about the reviewing of the United Nations, that this is a very short time that the countries have in order to present the really advancements in terms of the implementation. So peace for us, now we have some really huge challenges in terms of the implementation of the peace process, because it's not easy. I don't know what is more difficult, even to negotiate, to sign the peace, but or the implementation of the peace agreements, because there are so many commitments, there are so obligations from both sides. And this is in the part that we are now in Colombia trying to advance in the implementation of the peace agreement. But I think we will be successful. I think now the scenario in Colombia is different, like 3 or 4 years ago when we had the conflict. Now this is a country, in general terms, in peace, of course not exempt from criminal activity, from criminality and other threats that normally we have as a modern society. But the spirit of the people and the space of reconciliation, that is not difficult, because one of the most challenging things is how to reconcile society when you are in a conflict. And this is one of the stages that we are now, trying to overcome this past and to have a better society for Colombia, and not only good for Colombia, but also for the region and for the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And we're moving to Ireland. I don't know if you've been here already, but the CFO of the Environmental Ministry mentioned the report of Ireland as a model that they're trying to adopt. So tell us how we saw we saw the report. Tell us how it looks on the ground. How does Ireland implement the SDGs?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, ניתן and Anat and everybody else involved in organising this today. It's a great honour and a pleasure to be here, and I don't disagree with anything that the previous speakers have said, and some of what I will say is in very similar terms. What I didn't really agree with actually was the title of the panel. I mean, what can Israel learn from countries that have implemented it? We're all at the early stages of implementation, and some have more to do than others, and some are better in one area than they are in others. And this is why it's such a global, collegial exercise where we all have to work together. Now, Ireland has the negotiations for the SDGs were led by Ireland and Kenya. It was our perm reps in New York who did it, so we've always had a very strong affiliation, and that meant that an awful lot of people in Ireland knew about this exercise earlier than it might have been the case in other countries, which of course builds into commitment to implement. Now, if I take the Irish Development Aid Programme, the vision of our Development Aid Programme from the very start, when we started to work, is of a sustainable and just world where people are empowered to overcome poverty and hunger. So poverty and hunger have always been at the core of our development policies, and this of course strongly aligns with the vision of the 2030 agenda, even if we are in the developed in one of the developed countries, and my Colombian colleague Carlos was pointing out just the differences, in perspective as we reach them. And our aid programme has always been focused on the need to protect the most vulnerable in society. So we therefore strongly support the central tenet of the SDGs to leave no one behind and to reach the furthest behind first. So the SDGs just won't be met if we don't start with the most marginalised and take it from there. Now, how did we go about it, which is one of the questions. Now, we have a national implementation plan which was adopted last year, and each one of the 169 targets is listed down. There's a grid, and there's a lead agency there's a lead agency responsible for implementation. Now, these are government departments and ministries in the column. But prior to the national implementation plan being agreed, there was a wide range of consultations with civil society stakeholders. And some of them my Japanese colleague has mentioned, the same business, academia, civil society. In Ireland, the agricultural lobby is also very important. It's one of our biggest industries, and it's also one of the areas actually which is causing us some difficulties in meeting climate change, targets and our emissions targets. So when the national implementation plan was drawn up in full consultation with civil society before it was agreed and before responsibilities were allocated. And now there is a national stakeholders forum which monitors the progress of implementation. So it's kind of really down at a more micro level in many ways than the principles. And I know from what Galit Cohen has told me that Israel is trying to follow a very similar model. We presented our voluntary national report last July, and I think that Israel is doing its voluntary national report next year. And so we are in some consultations with Israel. Of course, we sit beside you at the UN. Ireland and Israel sit next to one another. So I've spent many years of my career in UN work, and it's always been great fun and pleasure to sit next to the Israelis. You learn a lot. You learn a lot, even if we disagree on some things. Yes. And what else? Where are we at on the SDGs? If I just look very quickly at the list, we're performing well in relation to the no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, and peace, justice and strong institutions. But we still have a lot to do in many other areas. We can't be complacent and think that we're doing very well. We have to look at the ones we're not doing well. And so we have to do more in relation to housing. We have quite a big homelessness crisis in Ireland. Levels of obesity have been growing. Achieving sustainable consumption and production, and this goes back to some of the agricultural production issues that I mentioned. diversity and habitat destruction, climate change, and then, I mean, we all have, I mean, Ireland has seen a lot of social progress in recent years, and I mean, we've had 2 referenda, which have led to great interest here. But we still have entrenched inequalities, and we need to mainstream a gender perspective into policy. Now, so far as I know, though, Israel is pushing forward in a very practical manner. And I know that there have been very positive comments at the UN about Israel's own actions and providing its own actions, and also that it has been providing a good platform for others in the areas of gender equality, education, and of course most particularly in innovation, given Israel's great expertise in that area. And another area that I know that Israel is very strong in is water and sanitation, and that's an area where there will be a lot to contribute in the future. Anyway, I think I'll leave it there, and happy to take questions or develop further.
Thank you. A big part of the UK's budget of the SDG is going to developing countries, is going to collaboration with them. Please expand on that.
Yeah, thanks, Bokuto, everyone. Morning. And that was going to be my first point, actually, so thank you for stealing my punchline at the outset. We do have a responsibility as a developing country, as a developed country, I should say, to provide leadership when it comes to implementation and achievement of these Sustainable Development Goals. And the UK is one of the few countries that is committing on an annual basis 0.7% of its GNI, its GDP basically, towards overseas development. And it's a small club globally. If you sat around the UN Security Council or the UN General Assembly table, not many countries can put their hands up when they say that year on year it's 0.7%. It's untouched by successive chancellors, by successive governments, whether it's a Labour government or a Conservative government in the UK. And as our economy grows, then that contribution will grow as well. And it's making an impact all around the world, whether that's in Africa, Latin America, here in the occupied Palestinian territories. It's something that we are proud of, and that we're insisting that other countries join us. Now, before I go through all 169 targets of the Sustainable Development Goals now the UK is doing, I thought I'd just pull out one example, really, because this session is all about the role of civil society, and I think it's really, really important. And I thought I'd zone in on one of the targets on climate action. It's something that, again, is of huge importance to us all, and it's something that is a high priority for the UK government. And I thought there's some quite interesting parallels. You can apply what I'm going to talk about here to any one of those 17 main areas of the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's about 5 key constituencies working hand in glove to tackle these issues. If it was just civil society, if it was just government, if it was just industry, if it was just us, the general public, as it were, then action wouldn't take place. So on climate, how is the UK going about this using those 5 key constituencies, and what's the role of government, first and foremost? I'm a representative of the government, so I thought I'd go first on government. Setting the policy framework, setting the legislative framework, stimulating and rewarding innovation, and providing a fiscal framework which not just incentivizes change, but also disincentivizes current practice. So let me give you one example on the incentivization point. Who thinks there are too many cars on the roads of Tel Aviv? Okay. Now, who'd like to see less GHGs and less pollution in Tel Aviv and Israel? Okay. Well, we had the same problem in London about 20 odd years ago, and governments, working alongside local governments as well, instituted in London the congestion charge. How much is it nowadays per day? 20 quid? So it's £20 per day, about 110 shekels, to drive your car into central London each day. So if you drive your car into London each day, each working day, that'll cost you about 550 shekels. Who thinks that's achievable in Tel Aviv?
It was 105 this morning.
It would be, I would say, politically ambitious of any government or of Mayor Holdai to institute such a policy in Tel Aviv, where if you go across a line in Jaffa, say, then you're going to have to pay over 100 shekels per day to drive your car in, even if that's only for a few minutes. But those are the kind of bold decisions that governments need to take to incentivize positive behavior. And that applies to climate, but it applies to so many of those issues there, whether it's poverty, whether it's food security. Those are the kind of tough decisions that governments need to take, and bold decisions that need to be taken. There needs to be a strong regulatory framework as well to hold industry and government to account to the highest standards, and again to stimulate that innovative approach. A scientific community needs to do what it needs to do across all these areas, whether that's stimulating world-class research, developing solutions, or indeed understanding the challenges that face each community, each city, each country, each continent. And I come back to that role of civil society that is so important. I mean, first of all, much like my Irish colleague mentioned, civil society were at the very core, the very first moments of how we developed our policy and our approach towards implementing and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And if they're not, it's not going to work. It just simply isn't going to work. So once those policies and those practices and those strategies are set with governments and civil society working in partnership, they need to hold government and indeed industry to account for achieving those aims and ambitions. And in the UK, they do. So for example, right now, the UK is trying to diversify its energy market. We've got a big offshore oil and gas industry, which I'm sure you've all heard of. That Israel is hoping to do the same in the years to come. But we've also got a lot of onshore gas below the ground. So we're trying to instigate a way of developing those resources. Fracking is the phrase that's used quite a lot. It's very controversial, and blimey, civil society are absolutely holding governments to account, our government to account, to ensure that resource is developed safely. Public engagement, I mean, civil society can often reach parts that government can't reach, so that public engagement piece and generating civic participation in those issues is so important. I mean, if there are a couple of NGOs here who are perhaps fighting passionately for that congestion charge in Tel Aviv, then maybe governments will sit up and take notice if that leads to a cleaner environment and a better way of life and a safer way of life for citizens of Tel Aviv moving forward. And then that campaigning piece as well is so important. And then alongside those four constituencies, regulators, government, scientific and research communities and civil society, industry has got a pivotal role to play, and obviously in climate action that is absolutely key in terms of innovating, in terms of finding new solutions. I mean, you look at that, I mean, Israel is a innovating country 101, startup nation, all that kind of stuff. There needs to be more of that, and governments need to provide, again, the policy and the fiscal framework which enables those companies and those individuals who've got those amazing ideas, whether that's on energy storage or battery-driven cars or what have you, to ensure that they can do their stuff. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask all of you how, well, you mentioned a bit of it, but how civil society is part of it. But I think maybe there are some questions from the audience, and maybe I'll give the stage to them.
My question was with the rise of political conservancy and I guess protecting one's borders. How are your governments looking towards building stronger institutions for peace and justice? I don't know if that makes sense. Do you understand what I asked?
Do you want to ask it to a specific country or in general?
Well, it was more towards Colombia and Ireland.
That's what I
all
thought.
of you feel free to answer, please.
And so we can begin with Colombia. Please address this question, and also the question of civil society. Is it part of the SDG implementation in Colombia?
Yes, I mentioned at the beginning of my comments regarding how we have a very strong formal framework, but how it develops in a really in the ground and how it will be implemented in the practice. So civil society is, I recognize that at the beginning was not part of the design of this framework, but finally the government, after the first voluntary review, had to acknowledge that the civil society plays an important role. So now it's part of the National Commission in Colombia, where the government every 3 months make a review of how the implementation of SDGs in many areas at the National Social and Development Council. So representation for the civil society is represented at the Commission. But I think we have to do more, to work more, as I mentioned here, in terms of the local and regional level. It means in terms of our municipalities, as I mentioned, for example, in the electoral campaigns, for example, for elections, candidates must include how they will work with the civil society in implementing the agenda of the projects. And also how NGOs, for example, can be not only Colombia, go to this National Commission, but also could be represented, for example, in forums like the United Nations, as ECOSOC, as you know, in ECOSOC they have the NGOs representatives, and how could be these NGOs not only be represented for the political issues, but also for the implementation of SDGs, not only in ECOSOC, but also in the HFPF. So this is regarding the civil society. In connection with your question, in fact, part of our conflict was, the weakness of the institutions and also justice in not only as a conceptual, issue, because we have an equality society. It's a very, Colombian society is really inequitable. I think there is a very big gap in people who enjoys all the benefits of the modern world, and other people, especially as I mentioned, in the remote areas, that they don't have opportunities for nothing. So, as I said in the SDGs, we have to work very much in all the goals and targets, because gender equality, for example, we have gender equality, but this is not for all women in Colombia. That's fine. Countries like Colombia, and I'm sure that many European countries, we need to work really hard in order to have a governance, strong institutions, and fighting against corruption, for example. But we are working on that. This is the most important thing, and the Agenda 2030 is a great tool in order to advance in those objectives.
Thank you very much. So we'll move to Ireland. The question about peace building and the civil society you've mentioned a bit when you spoke, but you have something to add.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. Yes, on the peace building side, I mean, the Good Friday Agreement, which was agreed 20 years ago, provides for a number of strands there. There's North-South and there's East-West, British-Irish, and then Northern Ireland. And if I take, for example, the North-South dimension, we have a joint secretariat with the British in Belfast, where we discuss, there are people from the Northern Ireland office there, and from our Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin, working there on the more political issues. And then in Armagh, which is a little bit further west, near the border, there is a secretariat there. There's an office there where every government department, north and south, is represented, and they discuss any items that have implications, for the other. And quite a few bodies in Ireland are actually All Ireland. I mean, waterways is based. The water is based up there. Tourism is All Ireland. Many sports are All Ireland. There are many things that are mixed, and this has done an awful lot. This is a very practical contribution on the peace building side. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
So we've not had the same kind of UK issues on this since the Good Friday Agreement 20 years ago. But going back to the development program that we have globally, just to give you an insight as to what we're doing here, in the occupied Palestinian territories, and it hits on so many of these development goals in terms of quality education, economic growth, and so on and so forth. Again, it'd be very easy for the UK to decide to put its development money elsewhere, but we think it's important that we're investing something like £80 million a year to see better access to justice for the Palestinians, to see better quality of education for the Palestinians. We don't have the same program here in Israel, because Israel obviously is it's not an owner country, it's a developed country. But we think if those ordinary Palestinians have got better access to education, quality of life, economic prospects, and so on and so forth, then the opportunity and the chance for a two-state solution will enhance. And it's not. It can be controversial here in some places, and we have quite difficult conversations sometimes with Israeli stakeholders as to why we are offering that assistance to the Palestinians. But we think it's the right thing to do, and most of the international community think the same.
And Japan, we'd like to hear how civil society is part of this big headquarters and big move that is going on. It seems that the SDGs are quite well implemented and known by this stage.
I haven't said that we have been really successful in implementing SDGs. If we look at Japan itself, we have a problem, the gender equality, number of the ministers, lady ministers, or the female parliamentary members, all the sort of indicators show that Japan is really behind, and climate change, or after Fukushima, we still really depend on the coal power plant, so we don't have a good, really good track record and so on. So there are so many issues, and we need the power of civil society. But I think it's up to the, how can I say, the NGOs and NPOs. Some NGOs really focus on the advocacy. I think it's important. But then while others are really operating overseas and focusing on concrete activities. So after all these NGOs are combined, they have a really strong voice and power. One thing I forgot to say that, and I think so far nobody has mentioned, it's how to engage the parliament. When it comes to the specific budget or policy items, parliamentary members are more or less interested in, but SDGs is not so far agenda. They really keen to pursue the as even back in the constituency, so the people in the constituencies do not raise SDGs issues. So we organize some sort of meeting between the parliamentary members and the civil society. I think civil society people can sort of raise the awareness of the parliamentary members on the SDGs. But thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask about the trend of armament. I mean, breaking from disarmament treaties, you know, how does that fit into the 2030 agenda? I mean, you didn't talk about it. You did speak about, you know, peace building, etc. But there is a global trend of rearmament among different countries in NATO, in the Middle East, I guess in the US, Russia, of course, and some of your countries as well. I mean, can you?
Well, of course, Ireland, which is very strongly committed to disarmament, thinks that this is a very dangerous trend. And one of the concerns that we would actually have nationally about Israel, even while we watch the trend on the nuclear side, which is, you know, very dangerous, but on a practical level, an awful lot of the conventional disarmament measures don't get as much attention as they probably deserve. To a nuclear weapon state.
Proud of it. It's a very good question. It's a very good question, and I completely support the Irish ambassador when she talks about how we need to do more to tackle the global scourge of landmines. We're spending money here, again in the OPTs to reduce those. Obviously, chemical weapons unacceptable, full stop, and cluster munitions. That is completely right. But it is a fact of life that countries want to protect their national security, and the arms trade is a global reality, and there's nothing we can do to get around that. And from a UK perspective, I was talking before about how we are proud that we are spending 0.7% of our GDP or GNI on overseas development aid. We're also spending 2% of our budget on defence spending. And we see that as a positive for our national security and generates a lot of popular support back in the UK. So I agree that there are areas of the disarmament agenda that need to be tackled and tackled robustly, including on the nuclear side. We do not want to see a nuclear Iran. We do not want to see a nuclear North Korea, for example. But we'll defend our national security when we need to.
Would you like to wrap this up, or continue to the next question?
Just for your information, I think there is no clear reference to the defense spending or security issues in the 169 targets. As well, it's I think it falls into the sovereignty of each country. But so when we talked about our sort of headquarters. How to engage the Ministry of Defense? It was a question. But the Ministry of Defense has to play some role in the disaster relief or maybe the gender equality and so on. But anyhow, the increase of the defense spending, if at the expense of their welfare or social security or all the other issues, I think it's not in compliance with the spirit of SDGs. So, but anyhow, it's not really a freely discussed issue.
My name is Dana. I'm from Itach and while you were talking, and I was thinking about SDGs, who needs to implement them. So suddenly I understood that we are talking in a very pretty much bubble arena, because governments, states and governments are not only the main actors, so we are just like expecting, and me as a human rights lawyer, we expect that we will have agreements and we will abide the agreements, and the players are more than all the task holders that we spoke about here. So I'm just, if we do speak about governments and states, and if we do speak about all the sectors that were represented here roughly, so I want to ask you, what do you think from a perspective of behavioral economics? What are the incentives of each of these sectors, the private, the government, if you see it more, what are the incentives? It follows the question about disarmament in a way, but this is the language we need to speak. What are our incentives to do all these amazing things that we salute to? We are soldiers of human rights, but who cares, So what are the incentives of governments to do it? If you have an answer.
I think nowadays market cares. I think why these CEOs, Japanese companies, they wear the pin badge. So they are now conscious that the SDGs is something really important for the activities of their companies. Now, these days, Ernst Young, KPMG, Deloitte, and PwC, all these sort of accounting and consulting companies, they do have a SDG section. And as the companies, how to address the SDGs is really important for their stock prices. So I think if one company really neglect SDGs, well, you can raise the human rights or the climate change, all these issues, it will really do harm to their stock prices. So market here. So that is my. Yeah.
Do you have any incentives that you would like to mention?
Well, what I would just say there is, sorry, is that this is where civil society plays its part in getting heavily involved in monitoring what's going on and keeping people.
You say shaming is an incentive?
No, but I mean, we're talking. I mean, if you take the very principled incentive is a more stable, peaceful, and secure world. You know, and then you're breaking that down into all its elements, from market chaos to armed conflict. No, but it may be immeasurable, but that's what civil society, the role of civil society in keeping governments pure on these issues.
Yeah, just to extend that, rather than talk about incentives, I'd like to focus on the essentials and talk to a human rights lawyer here. So, you know, it's about respecting the essential elements of any democracy and government's role in protecting and promoting those. So the independence of the judiciary, a free press, a thriving civil society. All the best governments that I've worked for and the best governments that I recognise around the world do all those things. In fact, some of the indicators in certain parts of the world are not so positive in the places where you would expect them to be very, very strong. So I think that's a government responsibility to ensure that those essentials are maintained.
Thank you. I just mentioned at the beginning of my comments regarding how the responsibility of the social corporate responsibility, and this is not only philanthropic. There are so many, in the SDGs projects that they are really, really good for the private sector to invest, especially infrastructure, like countries like developing countries like Colombia, for example. That many companies try to invest in areas that is very easy to have profits, but they are not having to go to the remote areas, and this is very difficult. But if you have incentives from the government, so you may be attractive for the private companies to invest in irrigation, in agro-industrial, developing in remote areas, far from the urban center. So there are so many ways in order to create this kind of interest in the private sector to make profitable really business. In terms of developing the agenda, would be beneficial not only for the private companies but also for the people.
Thank you.
Kim,
Hi, my name is Attar. I'm a master student in forestry. And I wanted to ask all of you, first, thank you, Your Excellencies, for coming to talk to us. And my question is about all of you, big countries have very big companies working abroad, that some of them are very polluting and damaging, and for example, companies that are going to exploit natural resources are doing tremendous damage, especially in Africa and other parts of the world. The SDGs are actually about internal policies, and I want to ask if any of your countries are willing or are going to implement the SDGs on their companies working.
That's a tricky question, huh?
Is that on? Yeah, it's on. So before I was in Israel, I was the UK's leading diplomat in Western Canada, where we had big companies like Shell and BP and others who were developing natural resources in Canada. And this question came up quite a lot. I mean, all British companies, we expect them to sign up to robust corporate social responsibility programs and responsibilities as well. OECD voluntary principles in terms of corruption and transparency and so on and so forth. And working with them in partnership, again, with civil society and with local and provincial governments and so on, to ensure that when companies are developing natural resources, they do so in the most sustainable way possible. Very easy to focus on big business as the kind of the bad guys here, and some of them do behave irresponsibly. That's sure globally. But they are meeting demand in so many ways. You know, we are very attached to our cars and aeroplanes and central heating or air conditioning or what have you. So there is absolutely a responsibility on big business when it comes to developing natural resources. But also I think it's a responsibility on consumers and governments to encourage ways that we can reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and move to more sustainable ways of getting around and living.
Consumers, yeah. Yeah, last question?
You didn't answer my question at all.
Let me tell you one story I had from my high school friend. He's working for the Japanese IT companies exporting semiconductor. But nowadays, requirement for these semiconductors are quite high. What we call conflict-free. So they are supposed to use rare metals from the countries where no sort of how can I say conflicts. If the sort of armed terrorist groups the export rare metals illegally, they are not supposed to use all these rare metals. So how they can trace all these materials? They need so many elements of and the materials, but they have to trace these days which country where they come from, and so that it's a really enormous task for all this. So I think times have changed. Even the big company, they now face up to the really severe sort of requirement condition. Maybe not all of them, but so this is where we are now.
I think the answer is to your question is that the country itself has to be clear about what it regulates, what not, and what is the line. For example, if BP is working in Israel, then Israel is responsible for what BP is doing in Israel and not the UK.
Why not?
This is a global
The question
world.
is why not? If you send the company out, you need to be responsible also for what your company.
Yeah, but the regulation is local, and this is how the market works. Let's go for the last question. Yes.
I'm in a movement of women wage peace, and I'm also taking part of activities, and I work with other organizations of civil society. And one of the barriers that I find out for bringing peace or getting to make peace is the conflicts and maybe gaps within our society, between the sectors of our societies. And it's also an issue, I think, that makes it hard to bring the civil society to be united and to be effective. And I wanted to ask if there any reference to that or implements to that in his.
So after 50 years of internal conflict, do you know, the governments try, do you know, to make peace with those populations with different measures. One was using the force, but it was not a solution. Finally, during the last government of President Santos, he was, do you know, take the courage to say, do you know, we have to sit down at the table to look what are the aspirations of those people, what are they are looking for. And they said, do you know, we need, do you know, more political space to present our aspirations, to be part of the society, to have a more inclusive society, a Colombia for all. And those claims, I think, do you know, were missing. And that's why we established a table of negotiations in order to find peace. And the result was the peace agreement. But do you know, it was, do you know, the real cause of our internal conflict, it was because we never listened and we excluded many parts of the population from their aspirations. And I think this is one part. And the aspirations most are related with SDGs. It means they don't have any social and economic opportunities. And that's why the cause of our internal conflict. We are still facing many, as I mentioned, inequalities, many constraints, many difficulties. But now we have a different, society, more open. We are now in the process of reconciliation, and we are trying to understand what was the reason, because we have that conflict with so many population that we never listen, and we excluded from the social development.
Thank you. I think this is a beautiful conclusion for everything. It sums it all up. I thank you again. It was fascinating, and let's all continue together to promote the SDGs.